Verified incident logs. Authentic footage. Pure accountability. Welcome to Bodycam Incident Reports.
Driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance.
Officer, you're currently standing on private property. What is your reasonable suspicion for detaining me here?
Tuesday, 9:15 p.m. The sprawling oak-lined streets of the highly exclusive suburban enclave were perfectly still. This was a neighborhood where properties were measured in acres, heavily insulated from the noise of the city by ancient trees and manicured hedges. Gliding silently down the dark, perfectly paved asphalt was a midnight black Mercedes-Benz, S-Class W223. Behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel sat James Owens. At 55 years old, James was a sharply observant, physically imposing black man. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal gray suit, with his silk tie loosened at the collar, he looked exactly like a highly successful executive returning to his personal sanctuary after a grueling 14-hour workday. But James wasn't a corporate CEO. He was the chief United States district judge for the region. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life navigating the highest, most complex tiers of the federal justice system. His signature authorized federal wiretaps and search warrants. He presided over massive civil rights lawsuits and held the absolute terrifying power to throw out evidence and destroy criminal cases if an officer stepped even a millimeter over the constitutional line. Tonight, however, James Owens was completely off the clock. He was sinking into the ventilated leather of his seat, enjoying the absolute, isolating silence of the Mercedes cabin. The S-Class was famous for its acoustic glass, turning the interior into an impenetrable vault that locked out the chaos of the outside world. Before we watch this deeply biased patrolman commit a career-ending felony on a federal judge's front lawn, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know what city or country you're watching from today. James kept his speed strictly under the neighborhood's heavily enforced 25-mile-per-hour limit. He was relaxed, listening to a low-volume jazz track, completely unaware that he was being actively hunted. 2 blocks back, creeping along in the deep shadows of the oak trees, keeping just enough distance to avoid being noticed, was Officer Michael Collins. Collins was driving his heavy Ford Explorer police interceptor with his main headlights killed, using only his amber running lights to stay hidden in the dark. He had worked this affluent, predominantly white suburb for 8 long years. He knew the layout of every cul-de-sac. He knew almost every family on this specific street by face, if not by name. And in his heavily biased, cynical mind, a black man simply didn't belong behind the wheel of a brand new 6-figure S-Class in this specific zip code. The officer had run the Mercedes license plate earlier when it first entered the neighborhood. The computer returned a completely clean result, registered to a James Owens, full insurance, absolutely no warrants. But a clean plate wasn't enough to override the officer's deep-seated prejudice. In Collins's twisted internal logic, a flawless record just meant the driver was a professional. To the patrolman, James wasn't a resident. He was an anomaly. He was a highly sophisticated burglar scoping out wealthy properties under the cover of darkness, or a high-end car thief looking for a target. Standard police procedure dictated that if Collins suspected a crime, he needed to initiate a traffic stop on the public roadway. But Collins was starving for a legal pretext, and the driver was giving him absolutely nothing. James used his turn signal precisely 100 feet before every turn. He stopped fully behind the thick white line at the stop signs. He didn't drift out of his lane. Collins knew that if he flipped his lights on now, without a shred of articulable reasonable suspicion, any decent defense attorney would eat him alive in court for an illegal stop. So, Collins made a tactical choice. He decided to stalk the vehicle, waiting for the driver to make a mistake or pull into a random driveway to steal a package. Up ahead, the sleek black Mercedes activated its turn signal and executed a perfectly smooth turn onto a long, sweeping private driveway paved with expensive interlocking gray stones. James drove up the slight incline, pulling his car to a gentle stop directly in front of his closed, three-car wooden garage doors. He shifted the electronic stalk on the steering column into park. He let out a long breath, unbuckled his seatbelt, and reached for his briefcase, ready to go inside his home. That was the exact moment Officer Michael Collins made the most catastrophic legal mistake of his entire life. Desperate to confront the man and prove his racist theories right, Collins didn't stay parked on the public street. He didn't walk up the driveway as a concerned citizen. He turned his heavy 2-ton police interceptor directly onto the private stone driveway, aggressively crossing the legal property line without a warrant, without an invitation, and without any exigent circumstances. He drove up the incline and slammed on the brakes, positioning his cruiser directly behind the Mercedes S-Class to intentionally block the vehicle from reversing. Then, Collins slammed his hand onto his center console control panel. The overhead light bar erupted. Blinding flashes of red and blue strobes instantly shattered the peace of the quiet property, painting the stone driveway, the manicured lawn, and the facade of the judge's home in the harsh, violent colors of a police detention. Inside the vault-like silence of his car, James Owens paused, his hand still resting on his briefcase. He looked calmly at the flashing lights illuminating his rearview mirror. As a federal judge, Owens understood something instantly, with absolute crystalline legal clarity. The officer behind him had no legal right to be on his property. In the eyes of the law, producing identification now would only legitimize a blatantly unlawful detention on his own land. The trap was set, and the officer had just locked himself inside it. The heavy door of the Ford Explorer Interceptor slammed shut with a metallic thud that echoed across the quiet lawns. Officer Michael Collins stepped out into the strobing red and blue lights, his posture radiating aggressive, manufactured authority. He unclipped his heavy tactical flashlight, resting his right hand instinctively on the grip of his holstered Glock 19. As he walked up the private stone driveway toward the black Mercedes S-Class, his boots crunched loudly in the dead silence of the night. Inside the S-Class, James Owens remained perfectly still. The thick acoustic glass of the W2-2-3 filtered out the crunch of the officer's boots and the harsh crackle of the police radio, leaving only the soft, ambient glow of the digital dashboard. The judge didn't scramble to find his wallet. He didn't reach for his glove box. He simply placed both of his large, empty hands visibly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel and waited. He was treating the situation not as a traffic stop, but as a real-time constitutional violation. When the patrolman reached the driver's side door, he shined the blinding high-lumen beam of his flashlight directly through the tinted glass, aggressively sweeping the interior before tapping the heavy metal casing against the window. James pressed the chrome switch on his door panel. The thick pane of acoustic glass glided down with a whisper, instantly letting in the chaotic, strobing glare of the light bar and the cold night air. "Evening?" Collins snapped, his voice tight and dripping with condescension. He didn't offer his name or his badge number. He leaned his heavy frame slightly toward the window, invading the judge's personal space. "Driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. And tell me exactly what business you have parked in this driveway." James did not move his hands from the steering wheel. He turned his head slowly, looking past the blinding beam of the flashlight to lock eyes with the patrolman. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a deep, resonant baritone that carried the effortless, immovable weight of a federal courtroom. "Officer," James stated calmly, completely ignoring the demand for documents, "you are currently standing on private property, specifically the curtilage of a private residence. What is your articulable, reasonable suspicion for initiating a detention on this land?" The precise, flawless legal terminology hit Collins like a physical blow. Street cops were used to panic, anger, or nervous stuttering, They were not used to being cross-examined with Supreme Court-level vocabulary by a black man in a custom-tailored suit. For a fraction of a second, the patrolman's brain short-circuited. Then, his ego violently took over. He interpreted the driver's knowledge of the law not as a defense, but as a direct, insolent threat to his authority. "I don't need a law lecture from you, buddy," Collins sneered, aggressively shifting his weight and resting his hand heavier on his gun belt. He immediately fell back on the oldest, most abused blanket excuse in modern policing. "We've had a string of burglaries in this exact neighborhood. You don't look like you belong here, and you were parked in a dark driveway with your engine running. That makes you a suspicious person. Now, hand over your ID before I pull you out of that seat for failure to identify." A vague, suspicious person claim requires specific articulable facts that a crime is occurring. Existing in a wealthy neighborhood while being black was not a crime. And under the Fourth Amendment, a police officer cannot legally demand identification during a consensual encounter, nor can they detain someone on their own private property without a warrant or exigent circumstances. James Owens knew every single nuance of this case law. He had literally written appellate opinions on it. He knew that if he handed over his driver's license right now, he would be legally submitting to the patrolman's false authority, turning an unlawful trespass into a legitimized police encounter. "Your justification is legally insufficient," James replied, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "You did not observe a traffic violation. You have no warrant. You have no specific victim or 911 call tying this vehicle to a crime. You have simply followed me onto my private property based on your own baseless profiling. I will not provide you with my identification because you have no lawful authority to demand it." Collins' face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. The strobing police lights illuminated the absolute fury building in his eyes. He was completely out of his depth legally, but on the street, he had the badge and the gun. He couldn't stand the fact that this man was looking at him not with fear, but with clinical, devastating pity. "You think you're smart? You think you can talk your way out of this?" The patrolman barked, stepping back from the door and ripping a pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metal ratchets clinked sharply in the night air. "You are now under arrest for interfering with a police investigation and failure to identify. Step out of the vehicle right now." James looked at the aggressive, sweating patrolman, then glanced up at the blinking green recording light on the officer's body camera. The trap had just snapped completely shut. "I am complying with your physical commands under duress," James said clearly, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. "But let the record show that you are now escalating an unlawful trespass into an armed kidnapping." The judge slowly unbuckled his seatbelt. He was ready to let Officer Michael Collins dig his own grave as deep as he possibly could. The heavy door of the Mercedes swung open. James Owens stepped out into the cool night air, slowly rising to his full height. Standing flat-footed on his own stone driveway, the judge was an imposing figure, broad-shouldered, over 6 feet tall, and radiating the kind of absolute quiet authority that cannot be faked. Officer Michael Collins instinctively took a half step back. The patrolman's hand tightened around the grip of his holstered weapon. He hadn't expected the driver to be this physically commanding. To compensate for his sudden, sharp spike of insecurity, the officer immediately escalated to physical dominance. "Face the vehicle! Put your hands on the roof of the car, right now!" Collins barked, his voice cracking slightly with a frantic rush of adrenaline. James didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He knew the absolute golden rule of dealing with an armed, legally compromised police officer. You fight them in the courtroom, not on the dark pavement. He turned his back to the patrolman and placed his large hands flat against the pristine, mirror-like black roof of his S-Class. The metal was cold beneath his palms. Collins lunged forward, grabbing James's left wrist with unnecessary violence. He yanked the arm down and back behind the judge's waist, wrenching the shoulder joint far beyond its natural resting point. James let out a sharp exhale through his nose, but offered zero physical resistance. He allowed his body to remain completely loose, purposefully denying the officer any opportunity to claim active resistance or tensing up. Click, click. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs bit brutally into James's wrists, pinning his tailored silk cuffs against his skin. The patrolman squeezed the metal ratchets excessively tight, ensuring maximum discomfort. "You are being detained for failure to identify and obstructing a police investigation," the officer announced, breathing heavily. He shoved his forearm into the center of James's back, forcefully pinning the handcuffed man against the side of the luxury sedan. Across the street, a porch light flicked on. The chaotic, strobing red and blue lights of the police cruiser were beginning to attract the attention of the neighborhood. Collins felt a surge of arrogant pride. He was catching a criminal right in the act, protecting this wealthy enclave from an outsider. He was doing his job. James turned his head just enough to angle his voice perfectly toward the center of the officer's chest, speaking directly into the microphone of the blinking body camera. "Officer," James stated, his voice carrying clearly over the ambient hum of the patrol cruiser's engine, "I am entirely unarmed and offering absolutely zero physical resistance. Let the recording reflect that you have forcefully removed me from my vehicle on the curtilage of my private property, without a warrant, without probable cause, and without exigent circumstances. You are officially executing an armed kidnapping." "I said shut your mouth," Collins snarled, pushing his forearm harder against the judge's spine. "You don't dictate the law to me. I dictate the law out here." Oh, how wrong he was. With the suspect securely restrained, the patrolman eagerly began the physical search. He aggressively patted down the outside of James's tailored trousers, his hands searching for contraband. He found nothing but a set of heavy brass house keys. No weapons, no burglary tools, no stolen jewelry, no drugs. Frustrated, but still burning with total arrogant certainty, the officer moved his hands to the charcoal gray suit jacket. He aggressively patted the chest, feeling a solid, rectangular weight resting in the inner breast pocket. "Got it," the patrolman muttered to himself, a twisted, triumphant smile forming on his lips. This was the moment. He was going to pull out that ID, shine his high-lumen flashlight directly onto the plastic, and prove once and for all that this arrogant suspect didn't live in this multi-million-dollar enclave. He was going to expose the lie, arrest the man for trespassing, and secure a massive victory for his own ego. Without asking for permission, the officer reached his hand inside the judge's custom-tailored jacket and pulled out a heavy, thick black leather wallet. He had absolutely no idea he was holding the detonator to his own career. Officer Michael Collins stepped back from the black Mercedes S-Class, leaving the handcuffed man pressed against the acoustic glass. The patrolman was breathing heavily, his chest puffed out with the arrogant satisfaction of a hunter who had just trapped his prey. He held the charcoal gray suit jacket's inner pocket contents in his right hand. It was a wallet, but the tactile sensation was immediately wrong. It was too thick, too heavy. It wasn't a standard flimsy bifold filled with credit cards and crumpled receipts. It was bound in thick, rigid, high-grade black leather, designed for a very specific structural purpose. Collins didn't care. He was practically vibrating with the anticipation of proving his biased theories correct. He wedged his tactical flashlight under his armpit, directing the blinding high-lumen LED beam straight down at his hands, ensuring his body camera captured the moment of triumph. He flipped the heavy leather open. He expected to see a cheap plastic driver's license displaying an address from the other side of the city. He expected a name he could run through the database to find a mountain of unpaid tickets or active warrants. Instead, the blinding white beam of his flashlight hit solid metal. First, it was the glare. A massive, heavy, recessed gold seal dominated the right side of the leather binding. It wasn't a cheap local police badge or a state trooper's star. It was a perfectly stamped, deeply grooved medallion that practically radiated authority. Second, the patrolman's eyes focused on the center of the gold seal. He saw the sharp, unmistakable talons and wings of the federal eagle, clutching the arrows and the olive branch. It was the Great Seal of the United States. Third, his gaze snapped to the federal identification card securely pinned to the left side of the leather flap. The portrait photo perfectly matched the face of the black man currently standing in handcuffs against the S-Class. The name was printed in stark, bold lettering, James Owens. Fourth, and finally, the officer read the title printed directly beneath the name. The letters seemed to burn themselves into his retinas. Chief United States District Judge. The air in Officer Collins' lungs instantly turned to ice. He stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray under the strobing police lights. His brain violently misfired, desperately trying to reject the catastrophic reality of what he was holding. He forced his eyes to scan the bottom of the federal ID card, searching for the residential address. It matched the numbers bolted to the stone pillar at the end of the driveway perfectly. The adrenaline that had been fueling his aggressive power trip instantly soured, turning into a cold, suffocating wave of pure terror. The heavy leather wallet suddenly felt like a live grenade in his hands. His fingers began to tremble so violently that the flashlight under his arm slipped, its beam shaking erratically across the driveway. The man he had just racially profiled, illegally followed, trespassed upon, and physically assaulted on private property wasn't a car thief. He wasn't a burglar. He was an Article III federal judge. He was a lifetime appointee, confirmed by the United States Senate. He was the highest-ranking judicial official in the entire federal district, a man whose literal daily job was to completely destroy law enforcement officers who violated the United States Constitution. And Collins had just dragged him out of his own car and locked him in steel handcuffs based on absolutely nothing but a racist assumption. The suspicious person excuse was dead. The failure to identify charge was a complete fabrication. By forcing the judge into handcuffs on his own curtilage, the patrolman had just crossed the line from a simple civil rights violation into a textbook felony deprivation of rights under color of law. And he had done it all while his own blinking body camera was actively recording the entire sequence of events. Collins slowly looked up from the wallet. James Owens was still standing exactly where the officer had left him, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The judge wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding his release. He was simply looking over his shoulder at the terrified patrolman. His dark eyes were entirely devoid of fear or anger. They were clinical, calculating, and completely merciless. It was the exact look of a man watching a criminal seal his own fate in a courtroom. The heavy leather wallet practically fell from Officer Michael Collins' trembling hands, landing with a soft thud on the pristine stone driveway. All the manufactured bravado, all the aggressive, puffed-up street authority that had fueled his actions for the last 10 minutes evaporated into the cold night air. He was left with nothing but the suffocating, paralyzing realization that he had just committed a felony against a chief United States District Judge. Collins stumbled forward, his boots dragging. He frantically reached for the small metal handcuff key clipped to his duty belt, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the tiny piece of steel. His face was slick with a cold sweat. Your Honor, the patrolman stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, breathless whisper. He desperately held the key out, stepping toward the handcuffed man. I am so sorry, sir. This was a massive misunderstanding, a terrible mistake. Let me just take these off you right now and we can... Do not touch me, officer, James Owens commanded. The judge didn't raise his voice a single decibel. The deep, resonant baritone simply cut through the night like a scalpel. Collins froze instantly, his hand hovering inches from the steel bracelets. You do not have my consent to remove these restraints, James stated, turning his body slightly so his face was perfectly framed by the officer's blinking body camera. His dark eyes were locked onto the terrified patrolman. "You initiated an unlawful detention based on blatant racial profiling. You escalated that detention into a physical assault and an armed kidnapping on my private property. These handcuffs are no longer a law enforcement tool. They are physical evidence of a federal crime committed under color of law." Collins swallowed hard, looking like he was going to be physically sick. "Please, Your Honor, I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. If you just let me—" "Step back," James interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Do not touch me, and do not mute your body camera. You will use your radio right now and request your watch commander to this exact location. Do it." Defeated, crushed, and hyperventilating, the patrolman slowly backed away. He unclipped his shoulder mic with a trembling hand and keyed it. "Dispatch! I need a supervisor to my 1020, code 3. The next 12 minutes were an agonizing, silent purgatory for Officer Collins. He paced erratically in the street, unable to look at the imposing figure standing calmly in the strobing lights. James Owens didn't move. He stood perfectly upright against his S-Class, enduring the biting pain in his shoulders and wrists, patiently waiting for the structural weight of the justice system to arrive. Finally, a white Ford Explorer with supervisor markings tore onto the street, pulling aggressively onto the edge of the driveway. Lieutenant Harrison, a 20-year veteran of the force, practically jumped out of the vehicle. Harrison took one look at the chaotic scene. He saw his pale, sweating patrolman standing in the grass, and then his eyes locked onto the tall, distinguished black man in the charcoal suit, handcuffed against the Mercedes. Harrison had been to federal court. He recognized the face immediately. All the blood rushed out of the lieutenant's face. "Collins, what the hell have you done?" Harrison breathed, sprinting up the driveway. "Why is Chief Judge Owens in handcuffs?" Before the panicked patrolman could stammer out a fabricated excuse, James spoke. "Lieutenant," the judge said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the hum of the idling engines, "your officer trespassed onto the curtilage of my property without a warrant or exigent circumstances. He unlawfully demanded identification, physically assaulted me when I correctly cited the Fourth Amendment, and executed a warrantless search of my person to retrieve my federal credentials." Lieutenant Harrison stopped in his tracks, staring in sheer horror at Collins. The patrolman looked down at the stone driveway, unable to deny a single word. He had done it all on camera. "My God, Your Honor, I am profoundly sorry," Lieutenant Harrison said, immediately pulling his own universal handcuff key and rushing forward. He quickly and carefully unlocked the steel ratchets. James slowly brought his arms forward, rolling his stiff shoulders and rubbing the deep red indentations on his wrists. He didn't thank the lieutenant. He simply straightened his suit jacket, looked down at his fallen wallet, and waited for Harrison to pick it up and hand it back to him. "Apologies do not amend constitutional violations, Lieutenant," James said smoothly, slipping the wallet back into his breast pocket. "I am officially instructing you to preserve all dash camera footage, body camera footage, and dispatch audio related to this incident. Tomorrow morning, I will be forwarding this entire file to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the local FBI Field Office for Prosecution under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Lieutenant Harrison closed his eyes, realizing his department was about to be hit with a catastrophic federal indictment and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit they could not possibly win. "Now," James Owens said, turning his back on the two officers and walking toward his front door, "get your vehicles off my property." He didn't look back to watch them scramble. He didn't need to. Officer Michael Collins was already a ghost, a man who had just permanently destroyed his own life because he couldn't stand the sight of a black man driving a nicer car than him. Talk about picking the absolute worst target for a power trip. Officer Collins thought he was above the law until he put handcuffs on the man who literally writes it. Do you think the officer deserves federal prison time for this illegal arrest? Drop your verdict in the comments below. If you love seeing corrupt cops face real, undeniable consequences, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next video on your screen right now. Stay safe out there.
The incident review concludes here. To support continued transparency, kindly like and subscribe. We appreciate you watching Bodycam Incident Reports.